Sometimes the most unexpected kindness comes from the most unlikely places. When struggling ski lift operator Caleb Tanner pulled over on that bitter December night, he thought he was simply helping a lost child through a mountain blizzard. The 8-year-old girl, trudging through the snowdrifts, looked like any other frightened youngster who needed shelter and warmth. He had no idea that little Harper's mother was Victoria Hale, the tech industry's most powerful CEO and one of America's wealthiest women. As Caleb wrapped the shivering child in blankets and read her stories by the fire, he was unknowingly caring for the daughter of a billionaire. When dawn broke and the search helicopters arrived, two worlds were about to collide in ways neither could have imagined. But would Victoria's immense wealth and influence ultimately bring these two struggling families together or tear them apart forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The snow-covered highway sign for Frost River had been barely visible through the whipping white curtain of the blizzard when Caleb Tanner first spotted the small figure stumbling along the roadside. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of his 15-year-old pickup truck as he squinted through the windshield, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the relentless snowfall. At 50, Caleb had seen enough mountain storms to know this one was different, the kind that turned familiar roads into death traps and left families wondering if their loved ones would make it home. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her small frame barely visible against the towering pine trees that lined the mountain highway. She wore what looked like an expensive purple winter coat, but even the finest gear was no match for a Colorado blizzard that had caught meteorologists off guard. Caleb pulled over without hesitation, his truck's hazard lights cutting through the darkness as he climbed out into the howling wind. "Hey there, sweetheart," he called out, his voice gentle despite having to shout over the storm. The little girl turned toward him, her face pale with cold and streaked with tears that had frozen on her cheeks. "What are you doing out here all alone?" She looked up at him with large, frightened eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "I got lost," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "My mummy is going to be so worried." Caleb's heart clenched as he knelt down to her level, snow immediately soaking through his work jeans. "Well, we can't have that, can we? Let's get you somewhere warm, and we'll figure out how to get you back to your mummy." He gently lifted the child into his arms, surprised by how light she felt even bundled in her winter gear. She didn't resist, instead pressing her face against his shoulder as he carried her to his truck. The warmth from the heater immediately began to thaw the ice crystals that had formed on her eyelashes and in her dark hair. "What's your name, honey?" Caleb asked, as he adjusted the heat vents to blow directly on her. "Harper," she said quietly, her small hands held up to the warming air. "Harper Elizabeth Hale." The name sounded familiar, though Caleb couldn't place it through his concern for the child's immediate welfare. He reached behind his seat and pulled out a thermos of coffee and a wool blanket that smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. "Well, Harper Elizabeth Hale, I'm Caleb. I've got some hot coffee here, but I think it might be too strong for you. How about we get you to my place where I can make you some hot chocolate?" Harper nodded gratefully, accepting the blanket as Caleb wrapped it around her shoulders. "Are you sure it's okay? My mummy always says not to go with strangers." "Your mummy is absolutely right about that," Caleb said, impressed by the child's caution despite her circumstances. "But sometimes there are exceptions, and being lost in a blizzard is definitely one of them. I have a son about your age, well, a little older, and if he were lost, I'd hope someone kind would help him too." The drive to Caleb's cabin took 20 minutes through roads that were becoming increasingly treacherous. Harper sat quietly beside him, occasionally glancing out at the swirling snow that made the familiar landscape look alien and dangerous. Caleb found himself stealing glances at her, noting the quality of her clothing and the articulate way she spoke. There was something about this child that suggested she came from a very different world than his own. Caleb's cabin sat at the end of a winding dirt road, surrounded by towering evergreens that provided some shelter from the worst of the wind. It wasn't much a modest two-bedroom structure he'd built himself after his wife Sarah had passed away 5 years ago, but it was solid and warm, with a stone fireplace that could heat the entire space and a kitchen that always smelled like whatever simple meal he was preparing for himself and his son. "Owen," Caleb called out as he helped Harper through the front door, stomping snow off their boots. "We've got a visitor." 12-year-old Owen Tanner looked up from the kitchen table where he'd been reading by lamplight, his sandy hair falling across wire-rimmed glasses that were perpetually sliding down his nose. He was a quiet boy, more comfortable with books than with other children his age, but his face immediately showed concern when he saw the young girl shivering beside his father. "Dad, what happened?" Owen asked, immediately getting up to help. "Found this young lady walking along the highway in the storm," Caleb explained, as he helped Harper out of her wet coat. "Harper, this is my son Owen. Owen, meet Harper." Owen's natural shyness melted away in the face of someone who clearly needed help. "Hi, Harper. Are you okay? You must be freezing." While Caleb built up the fire in the stone hearth, Owen busied himself making hot chocolate, carefully measuring cocoa powder and milk in a way that showed he'd done this many times before. The cabin's interior reflected the practical simplicity of their live handmade furniture that Caleb had crafted in his spare time. Shelves lined with Owen's collection of nature guides and science books, and family photographs that showed happier times when Sarah had been alive. Harper settled into the worn leather armchair closest to the fire, her eyes taking in every detail of the cabin with obvious curiosity. "You built all this furniture yourself?" she asked Caleb, running her small hand along the smooth arm of the chair. "Sure did," Caleb replied, pleased by her interest. "Started as a hobby, but it turned into something more after it was just Owen and me. There's something satisfying about creating something useful with your own hands." "My daddy never makes anything," Harper said matter-of-factly, accepting the mug of hot chocolate that Owen offered her. "He's always too busy with meetings and phone calls." Owen perched on the edge of the couch, his own mug warming his hands. "What does your dad do?" "I'm not really sure," Harper admitted. "Something with computers and money. Mommy says he's very important, but he doesn't live with us anymore." The simple statement hung in the air, and Caleb felt a familiar pang of recognition. He knew what it was like to be a single parent, though his circumstances had been thrust upon him by tragedy rather than choice. "Well," Caleb said gently, settling into his own chair with a cup of coffee, "sometimes families look different than we expect them to. The important thing is that the people who love you are doing their best to take care of you." Harper nodded thoughtfully, then looked around the cabin again. "It feels cozy here, like the houses in fairy tales." "Speaking of fairy tales," Owen said, his eyes lighting up, "Dad reads the best stories. He does all the voices and everything." "Really?" Harper's face brightened for the first time since Caleb had found her. "Could you read me a story? Mommy is always too busy, and our nanny just plays audiobooks." Caleb's heart softened at the request. He walked to the bookshelf and pulled out a worn copy of Grimm's fairy tales, its spine cracked from years of bedtime readings with Owen. "What kind of story would you like to hear?" "Something with a happy ending," Harper said quietly. "I like stories where everything works out okay." As Caleb settled back into his chair and opened the book, the storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small cabin, warmth and companionship pushed back against the cold and darkness. Owen curled up on one end of the couch, while Harper remained in the armchair, both children's faces illuminated by the dancing flames in the fireplace. "Once upon a time," Caleb began, his voice taking on the storytelling cadence that had comforted Owen through many difficult nights, "in a kingdom far away, there lived a kind woodcutter who found magic in the simplest things." As the story unfolded, Harper's eyelids grew heavy, the combination of warmth, safety, and Caleb's gentle voice finally allowing her to relax after what had clearly been a terrifying ordeal. Owen watched her with the protective instinct of an older sibling, occasionally glancing at his father with a look that said he understood they were taking care of someone who needed them. Outside, the blizzard showed no signs of letting up, but inside the cabin, Three people who had been strangers an hour ago were discovering the simple truth that kindness shared makes any space feel like home. None of them could have imagined that by morning their quiet mountain sanctuary would be the center of a media storm that would change all their lives forever. Dawn broke over Frost River with the peculiar stillness that follows a mountain blizzard. The storm had exhausted itself sometime before sunrise, leaving behind a landscape transformed by nearly 3 feet of pristine snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds under the morning sun. Caleb stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching the world emerge from its white cocoon, while Harper and Owen still slept peacefully in the living room, where they'd eventually drifted off during the third fairy tale. The first sign that their quiet morning was about to be shattered came as a distant thumping sound that grew steadily louder. Caleb frowned, setting down his coffee as he recognized the distinctive rhythm of helicopter rotors cutting through the thin mountain air. One helicopter became 2, then 3, their search patterns methodical and urgent as they swept across the valley below his cabin. "Dad?" Owen appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What's all that noise?" Before Caleb could answer, Harper sat up on the couch, instantly alert in the way that suggested she'd been awakened by helicopters before. Her face went pale as she looked toward the window, and Caleb saw something that looked almost like fear cross her features. "They're looking for me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing sound of aircraft. "Mommy must be so scared." The helicopters were joined by the distant sound of engines struggling up the mountain road, multiple vehicles moving in convoy formation. Caleb felt a growing sense of unease as he realized that Harper's rescue was going to involve far more than a simple phone call to worried parents. The scale of the search operation suggested resources that went well beyond what most families could marshal, even in an emergency. "Harper," Caleb said gently, kneeling beside the couch, "I need you to tell me about your mommy. What's her name?" "Victoria Hale," Harper said simply, as if the name should explain everything. Owen's sharp intake of breath made Caleb turn. His son was staring at Harper with wide eyes, his face a mixture of awe and something approaching panic. "Dad," Owen said slowly, "Victoria Hale is the CEO of Hale Tech Industries. She's on the cover of Forbes magazine. She's like he's one of the richest people in America." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity as Caleb remembered where he'd heard the name before. Victoria Hale, tech mogul, whose company had been in the news for its innovative data centers and whose personal wealth was estimated in the billions. Her face had been on the cover of Business Week just last month, photographed in a sleek corporate boardroom that probably cost more than Caleb's entire cabin. "Oh," Caleb said quietly, the single word carrying the weight of his growing realization about what Harper's rescue would mean. "Oh, Harper." The sound of vehicles grew closer, and through the window, Caleb could see a line of black SUVs navigating the treacherous mountain road with the kind of precision that suggested professional drivers. The helicopters had found their target and were now circling overhead, their downdraft creating small tornadoes of loose snow around the cabin. Harper climbed down from the couch and walked to the window, pressing her small hand against the glass as she watched the approaching convoy. "Mommy's going to be really mad that I got lost," she said matter-of-factly. "She always says I need to be more careful." "Sweetheart," Caleb said, his voice gentle but firm, "your mommy isn't going to be mad. She's going to be relieved and grateful that you're safe. Sometimes when people are scared, it can look like anger, but it's really just love that doesn't know how to express itself." The first SUV pulled up to the cabin, its black paint gleaming despite the rough journey up the mountain. The driver's door opened, and a tall man in an expensive suit emerged, followed by what looked like a small army of similarly dressed individuals. But it was the woman who stepped out of the second vehicle that commanded immediate attention. Victoria Hale was smaller than Caleb had expected, perhaps 5'6" in her designer winter boots, but she carried herself with the kind of authority that filled whatever space she occupied. Her dark hair was pulled back in a precise bun despite the early hour and difficult circumstances, and her winter coat probably cost more than Caleb made in 6 months. But it was her eyes that struck him most intelligent, calculating, and currently filled with a mixture of relief and barely controlled anxiety. "Harper!" Victoria's composed facade cracked as she spotted her daughter through the window. She moved toward the cabin with quick, purposeful steps, her entourage following at a respectful distance. Caleb opened the door before she could knock, and Harper rushed past him into her mother's arms. Victoria knelt in the snow, heedless of her expensive clothing, and held her daughter with the fierce protectiveness of a parent who had spent the night imagining the worst possible outcomes. "Oh, baby," Victoria whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I was so scared. When the school called and said you'd gotten off the bus at the wrong stop during the storm." She pulled back to look at Harper's face, her hands checking for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Mommy," Harper said, her own voice small but steady. "This is Caleb and Owen. They took care of me. Caleb read me stories and Owen made me hot chocolate." Victoria's eyes moved to Caleb for the first time, and he felt the full weight of her assessment. He was acutely aware of his appearance: 5 days of stubble, work clothes that had seen better years, and hands that bore the permanent stains of someone who worked with his hands for a living. Standing in the doorway of his modest cabin, he felt the vast gulf between their worlds more keenly than ever. "You're the one who found her," Victoria said, rising to her feet but keeping one hand on Harper's shoulder. "Mr. Tanner, Caleb Tanner." He stepped aside to let them into the cabin, though the space suddenly felt impossibly small with Victoria's presence filling it. "And this is my son, Owen." Owen, who had been hanging back nervously, stepped forward with the good manners his father had instilled in him. "Nice to meet you, Miss Hale. Harper's really nice. She knows lots of interesting things." Victoria's expression softened slightly as she looked at Owen, perhaps recognizing something of her own daughter's intelligence in his serious demeanor. "Thank you, Owen, and thank you, Mr. Prosses. Tanner, for taking care of Harper." She paused, clearly struggling to find words adequate to the situation. "I can't imagine what might have happened if you hadn't found her." "Anyone would have done the same thing," Caleb said simply, though he could see from Victoria's expression that she wasn't entirely convinced that was true. Harper tugged on her mother's coat. "Mommy, can we stay a little longer? Caleb was going to show me his workshop, and Owen wants to show me his rock collection." "Sweetheart, we need to get you home," Victoria said gently. "You've been through an ordeal, and I need to have a doctor look at you to make sure you're completely fine." "But I feel fine," Harper protested, "and I like it here. It's peaceful." Caleb caught the subtle way Victoria's jaw tightened at her daughter's words, as if the innocent comment had struck a nerve. He began to sense that the Hale family's wealth might come with its own set of complications and pressures. "Mr. Tanner," Victoria said, her voice taking on the brisk, businesslike tone that had probably dominated countless boardroom negotiations, "I'd like to offer you a reward for your kindness. Name your price." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Caleb felt Owen stiffen beside him. He understood what Victoria was doing, reducing their interaction to a transaction that could be neatly concluded with a check. It was probably how she handled most of life's complications, but something about the approach rubbed him the wrong way. "I don't want your money, Miss Hale," Caleb said quietly. "I helped Harper because she needed help. That's what people do for each other." Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly, as if she'd encountered an unexpected variable in her calculations. "Surely there's something college fund for Owen, perhaps? A new truck? Home improvements?" "Actually," Caleb said, glancing at his son, "there is something. Owen's been wanting to visit the Science Museum in Denver for months. If you're heading back to the city, maybe he could ride along. He's fascinated by the planetarium there." Victoria looked genuinely surprised by the modest request. That's all you want? A ride to a museum?" "That's all I want," Caleb confirmed. "Owen's got a brilliant mind, and he doesn't get many chances to explore the kind of exhibits they have in the city. It would mean a lot to him." Owen's face lit up with excitement, but he looked to his father for confirmation. "Really, Dad? Could I?" If Miss Hale doesn't mind the company, Caleb said. Victoria studied them both for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Mr. Tanner, I have to scare you, sure you're not. She stopped herself, perhaps realizing how the question might sound. Not what? Caleb asked calmly. Not trying to get something more out of this situation. In my experience, everyone wants something. The words revealed more about Victoria's world than she probably intended, and Caleb felt a flicker of sympathy for her. Miss Hale, I imagine in your line of work, that's often true. But I'm not everyone. I'm just a man who helped a child who needed help. Harper had been listening to the exchange with the focused attention of someone older than her years. Mommy, she said quietly, why are you being mean to Caleb? He's nice. Victoria's composed expression cracked slightly. I'm not being mean, sweetheart, I'm just... She looked at Caleb again, and he saw something vulnerable flicker across her features. I'm just not used to people who don't want anything from me. Well, Caleb said gently, maybe that says more about the people you usually meet than it does about people in general. The observation hung between them, and Victoria's careful mask slipped just enough for Caleb to see the loneliness underneath. He realized that for all her wealth and success, Victoria Hale might be more isolated than he'd ever been, even in his darkest moments after Sarah's death. All right, Victoria said finally. Owen can ride with us to Denver, but I insist on covering any expenses while he's there. That's very generous, Caleb said. Thank you. As they prepared to leave, Harper clung to the worn fairy tale book Caleb had read from the night before. Can I keep this? Just to remember? Caleb glanced at Victoria, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Of course you can, sweetheart. But remember, the real magic isn't in the book. It's in the people who care enough to share the stories. As the convoy prepared to depart, Caleb found himself watching Victoria Hale with new eyes. Beneath the polished exterior and commanding presence, he sensed a woman who had built walls so high and strong that even she had forgotten what it felt like to let someone inside. Harper's innocent observation about the cabin being peaceful had clearly unsettled her, suggesting that peace was something in short supply in their wealthy but complicated world. The helicopters lifted off first, their rotors beating a steady rhythm against the mountain air. Victoria paused at the door of her SUV, looking back at the cabin where her daughter had found safety and kindness from strangers. Mr. Tanner, she called out, perhaps you'd like to visit the data center we're building in the valley. I think you might find it interesting. It was an unexpected invitation, and Caleb found himself nodding before he'd fully considered the implications. I'd like that. As the convoy disappeared down the mountain road, Caleb stood alone in the snow, realizing that his quiet life in Frost River was about to become significantly more complicated. Two worlds had collided in his small cabin, and the reverberations were just beginning to spread. 3 days later, Caleb found himself driving down a winding mountain road toward the valley floor, following directions to Hale-Tech's construction site that Victoria had provided, along with Owen's safe return from Denver. His son had come back from the city trip transformed eyes, bright with excitement, as he described the planetarium show, the interactive exhibits, and the conversation he'd had with Victoria during the drive about quantum physics and environmental science. Dad, you should have seen it, Owen had said, his words tumbling over each other in his enthusiasm. They had this whole section on renewable energy, and Miss Hale actually listened when I told her about the owl migration patterns I've been tracking. She said most adults don't pay attention to things like that. Now, as Caleb navigated the curves that led to the valley floor, he reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. Victoria had been true to her word about the museum visit, but she'd also surprised him by calling personally to invite him to see the data center project. There had been something in her voice, a hesitancy, that suggested the invitation meant more than just polite gratitude. The construction site appeared around a bend in the road, sprawling across several acres of what had once been pristine meadowland. Massive earth-moving equipment carved geometric patterns into the landscape, while crews of workers in hard hats moved with purposeful efficiency. The scale of the operation was impressive, but Caleb found himself frowning as he took in the full scope of the project. Victoria was waiting for him at the site office, a temporary structure that managed to look both functional and elegant. She'd traded her corporate attire for practical work, clothes, khaki pants, sturdy boots, and a fleece jacket that still somehow managed to look designer-made. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and Caleb was struck by how much more approachable she seemed in this setting. "Mr. Tanner," she said, extending her hand in greeting, "thank you for coming. I hope Owen enjoyed his museum visit." "He hasn't stopped talking about it," Caleb replied, accepting her handshake. "You made quite an impression on him. He said you actually discussed his research on local wildlife patterns. Your son is remarkably well informed for a 12-year-old, Victoria said, and Caleb could hear genuine respect in her voice. "He knows more about the ecosystem here than most of my environmental consultants." She led him toward the construction site, pointing out various aspects of the project as they walked. "This will be one of the most advanced data centers in the country when it's completed. The server farms will be cooled using geothermal energy, and we're implementing cutting-edge efficiency protocols that should reduce our carbon footprint by 60% compared to traditional facilities." Caleb nodded, impressed despite himself by the scope of the undertaking. But as they walked closer to the active construction area, his practiced eye began to notice details that troubled him. The placement of certain structures, the way the access roads had been graded, the proximity to what looked like a natural water source, all of it added up to potential problems that went beyond engineering specifications. "The cooling system draws water from the underground spring system?" he asked, pointing toward a series of pipes that disappeared into the ground. "Yes," Victoria confirmed. "It's one of the most efficient aspects of the design. The natural spring water maintains a constant temperature year-round, which makes it perfect for our cooling needs." Caleb stopped walking, his attention caught by something at the edge of the construction zone. Owen's meticulous notes flashed through his mind-detailed observations about animal behavior patterns, migration routes, and seasonal changes that his son had been documenting for years with the passion of a true naturalist. "Miss Hale," he said slowly, "do you know what this valley is used for in the spring?" Victoria looked puzzled by the question. "I'm not sure what you mean. According to our environmental impact studies, it's largely unused land." "It's a migration corridor," Caleb explained, walking toward the area that had caught his attention. "Every spring, elk herds move through here on their way to higher elevations. They've been using this route for generations. It's part of their genetic memory. And that spring system you're tapping into, it's their primary water source during the migration." He knelt down beside what looked like a faint depression in the earth, invisible to most people, but clearly recognizable to someone who understood wildlife patterns. "See these traces? Elk trails. They're not obvious because the herds only use them for a few weeks each year, but they're as important to the animals as highways are to us." Victoria frowned, clearly processing this information. "Our environmental consultants didn't mention anything about elk migration." "When did they conduct their studies?" Caleb asked. "Last fall and early winter," Victoria replied, and Caleb could see understanding beginning to dawn in her expression. "The elk would have already moved to their winter range by then," he explained. "They won't be back until late April or early May. Your consultants missed them because they were looking at the wrong time of year." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving across the construction site with new eyes. "What would happen if we proceeded with the current design?" "The access roads would block their traditional routes," Caleb said, matter-of-factly. "The herds would either have to find new paths which could take generations to establish, or they'd try to use the old routes and come into conflict with your operations. Neither option is good for the elk or for your data center." "Could the design be modified?" Victoria asked, and Caleb was surprised by the genuine concern in her voice. "Probably," he said, "but it would require some significant changes to the road placement and maybe the location of some of the cooling infrastructure. It wouldn't be cheap." Victoria pulled out her phone and began scrolling through contacts. "I need to speak with my project manager and the environmental team. This is exactly the kind of problem that costs more to fix later than it does to address now." As she made her calls, Caleb found himself studying Victoria with new interest. He'd expected her to dismiss his concerns or to calculate the cost of addressing them against the potential for negative publicity. Instead, she seemed genuinely troubled by the possibility that her project might harm the local ecosystem. Owen appeared in his mind's eye, bent over his notebook as he sketched the tracks of various animals and recorded their behavioral patterns. His son's careful observations had provided the key to understanding something that trained consultants had missed: a reminder that wisdom often came from patient attention to details that others overlooked. "Mr. Tanner," Victoria said, ending her calls and turning back to him, "I'd like to hire you as a consultant on this project. Your local knowledge could help us identify other potential issues before they become problems." Caleb blinked in surprise. "Miss Hale, I'm not a trained environmental scientist. I'm just someone who pays attention to the woods and the animals that live in them." "Sometimes that's more valuable than formal training," Victoria replied. "Owen's research, your observations, they represent the kind of long-term, detailed knowledge that you can't get from a brief consulting engagement. You understand this place in a way that outsiders can't." "I already have a job," Caleb pointed out. "The ski resort depends on me, especially during peak season." "I understand that," Victoria said. "But this wouldn't be full-time work. More like periodic consultations, reviewing plans, and walking the site to identify potential issues. The pay would be significant enough to supplement your income substantially." Caleb found himself considering the offer more seriously than he'd initially intended. The additional income would make a real difference for Owen's future college funds, better equipment for his scientific interests, perhaps even some stability in their often precarious financial situation. "What exactly would you expect from me?" he asked. "Exactly what you just did," Victoria said simply. "Look at our plans with the eyes of someone who knows this land intimately. Help us build something that works with the natural environment instead of against it." As they walked back toward the site office, Caleb noticed Owen's handmade science journal tucked under Victoria's arm. She'd asked to borrow it after their museum trip, wanting to study his documentation of local wildlife patterns. The worn notebook looked out of place in her polished professional environment, but she carried it with the respect usually reserved for expensive reports and technical documents. "Owen's work is quite remarkable," Victoria said, noticing his glance. "His observations about seasonal changes in animal behavior are more detailed than anything in our official environmental studies. Where did he learn to document things so thoroughly?" "Trial and error, mostly," Caleb replied. "And a lot of patience. I taught him that if you're going to do something, you might as well do it right." "It shows," Victoria said. "His methodology is better than what I see from many professional researchers. He has a natural scientist's mind." They paused at Victoria's rental car, a sleek sedan that looked slightly out of place in the construction site environment. "I meant what I said about the consulting work," she said. "Think about it. I believe we could help each other. You'd bring knowledge we need, and the compensation would provide opportunities for Owen that might otherwise be out of reach." Caleb nodded slowly. "I'll consider it. But I need to be clear about something. If I do this, I won't compromise my principles for your profits. If I see something that could harm the environment or the wildlife, I'll speak up, even if it costs you money." Victoria smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, the expression seemed completely genuine. "Mr. Tanner, I wouldn't expect anything less. In fact, that's exactly why I want you on this project." As Caleb drove back up the mountain toward Frost River, he found himself thinking about the conversation in ways that went beyond the immediate offer of work. Victoria Hale had surprised him not just with her willingness to consider changing expensive plans based on his observations, but with her genuine interest in Owen's scientific work and her respect for knowledge that came from experience rather than formal education. The worn science journal had represented something important in their interaction, a bridge between Owen's careful observations and Victoria's resources, between local wisdom and corporate capability. For the first time since he'd met the tech mogul, Caleb began to think that their collision of worlds might produce something beneficial rather than destructive. But as he navigated the familiar curves of the mountain road, he also felt a nagging uncertainty about what accepting Victoria's offer might mean for the quiet life he and Owen had built in Frost River. Some changes, no matter how well-intentioned, had consequences that reached far beyond their immediate effects. 2 weeks later, Caleb found himself wearing his best flannel shirt and cleanest work jeans as he prepared for another consultation at the Hale Tech site. What had begun as a single review of environmental concerns had evolved into regular meetings as Victoria's team discovered the depth of knowledge that Caleb and Owen brought to the project. The consulting fees were more generous than Caleb had expected, providing a financial cushion that allowed him to think about Owen's future with less anxiety than he'd felt in years. Victoria had surprised him by requesting that Owen be included in the consultations, recognizing that the boy's systematic observations contained insights that professional studies had missed. Now, as they drove down to the valley for their third site visit, Owen sat beside him with his science journal expanded into a proper binder, complete with detailed maps, seasonal calendars, and photographs that documented wildlife patterns with scientific precision. "Dad," Owen said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed his latest notes, "I've been thinking about Miss Hale's cooling system design. What if instead of diverting the spring water, they created a heat exchange system that doesn't actually remove water from the natural flow?" Caleb glanced at his son with pride. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes the difference between a good solution and a great one. Have you sketched out how that might work?" Owen flipped to a page covered with careful diagrams. "I looked up geothermal heat pumps online at the library. The principle is similar, but scaled up. They could get the cooling effect without disrupting the water source that the elk depend on." The transformation in Owen over the past few weeks had been remarkable. Victoria's genuine interest in his work had given him confidence to pursue his ideas more boldly, while the resources she'd provided, including access to technical databases and consultation with her engineer Shad, elevated his natural curiosity into something approaching real research capability. At the construction site, they were met by Victoria and her project manager, an efficient woman named Sarah Chen, who had initially been skeptical of consulting with a 12-year-old, but had quickly become one of Owen's most enthusiastic supporters. "Owen," Sarah said, greeting them with a smile, "I've been looking forward to seeing your heat exchange proposal. The preliminary calculations you sent were intriguing." Victoria was dressed in her now familiar work attire, but Caleb noticed that she'd traded her expensive boots for practical hiking shoes and had acquired a canvas jacket that showed signs of actual use. The gradual evolution of her appearance reflected something deeper, a growing comfort with the practical, hands-on aspects of the project that went beyond boardroom presentations and financial projections. "Before we discuss the technical modifications," Victoria said, "I wanted to show you something." She led them to a trailer that served as the on-site office, where the walls were covered with detailed maps and planning documents. But what caught Caleb's attention was a large aerial photograph that showed the construction site in the context of the broader valley ecosystem. "I had our survey team create this comprehensive overview," Victoria explained. "It shows not just our project footprint, but the wildlife corridors, water sources, and seasonal habitat areas that Owen identified. We're redesigning the entire site layout to work with these natural patterns instead of against them." The photograph was marked with colored overlays that showed elk migration routes, bird nesting areas, and the complex network of springs and streams that fed the valley's ecosystem. Owen's careful observations had been translated into a professional planning document that would guide millions of dollars in construction decisions. "This is incredible," Owen said softly, studying the detailed mapping of his beloved wilderness. "You can actually see how everything connects." "That's exactly the point," Victoria said. "Your documentation helped us understand that we weren't just building in an empty valley, we were inserting ourselves into a complex, functioning ecosystem. The question became how to do that responsibly." Sarah spread additional drawings across the table, showing revised construction plans that incorporated Owen's suggestions and Caleb's practical insights. The heat exchange system Owen proposed will actually be more efficient than our original design, she explained, and by relocating the access roads to follow natural contours, we've reduced both our environmental impact and our construction costs. Caleb studied the revised plans with growing amazement. You've essentially redesigned the entire project. We've improved it, Victoria corrected. The new design is better in every measurable way, more efficient, more sustainable, and more cost-effective in the long run. Owen's observations didn't just help us avoid problems, they helped us find better solutions. As they toured the revised construction site, Caleb began to understand something important about Victoria Hale that went beyond her reputation as a ruthless businesswoman. She was genuinely curious about the world around her, and when presented with information that challenged her assumptions, she was willing to change course, even when it required significant additional investment. "Ms. Hale," Owen said as they paused near the area where the elk trails intersected with the planned cooling infrastructure, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you decide to build the data center here? I mean, there are lots of places that would be easier to develop." Victoria was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving across the valley that stretched toward the distant peaks. "Honestly, initially, it was about cost and efficiency. This location offered geothermal resources, fiber optic access, and favorable land prices. But spending time here, working on this project, I'm beginning to think there are other considerations that matter just as much." "Like what?" Owen asked with the directness that only children could manage. "Like whether what we're building actually improves the world," Victoria said simply. "I've spent most of my career focused on metrics, profits, market share, technological advancement. But your research has made me think about different kinds of success. What good is the most efficient data center in the world if it destroys something irreplaceable in the process?" Caleb found himself studying Victoria with new understanding. Beneath the corporate executive was someone genuinely wrestling with questions about purpose and responsibility that went beyond financial returns. It was a side of her that he suspected few people ever saw. "You know," Caleb said carefully, "Owen and I were talking about this project, and he had an interesting observation. He said that the best solutions usually work for everyone, the people, the animals, and the business. It's only when you try to optimize for just one thing that you run into trouble." "Wisdom from a 12-year-old, Victoria said with a smile that reached her eyes. "I should probably put that in my next board presentation." As the afternoon wore on, Caleb watched the interaction between Victoria and Owen with growing appreciation for how naturally they worked together. Despite the vast differences in their backgrounds, they shared a fundamental curiosity about how things worked and a willingness to revise their assumptions when presented with new information. Victoria's tool belt, practical and well used, had become a symbol of her transformation from remote corporate leader to hands-on project manager. She wore it with the same confidence she'd once reserved for designer suits, and Caleb could see that it represented something important to her connection to the practical, tangible work of building something meaningful. "Mr. Tanner," Victoria said as they prepared to leave, "I have a proposition for you. Harper is coming to visit next weekend, and she's been asking about Owen and the cabin ever since our museum trip. Would you be willing to have us as guests? I could rent rooms in town, but Harper specifically requested to stay where she felt safe during the blizzard." The request was unexpected, and Caleb found himself hesitating. Having Victoria and Harper as house guests would be very different from their professional consultations. It would mean opening his personal life to someone whose world operated by rules he didn't fully understand. "I don't have much room," he said honestly. "It's just a 2-bedroom cabin, and Owen and I live pretty simply." "Harper mentioned that," Victoria said. "She said that's what she liked about it. She's been staying in hotels and corporate apartments most of her life. I think she'd find your cabin refreshingly real." Owen looked at his father with obvious hope. "Harper's really smart, Dad, and she asks good questions about everything. I think she'd like to see the owl nesting sites I've been monitoring." Caleb realized that his son had found in Harper something he'd rarely experienced: a peer who shared his intellectual curiosity and didn't find his interests strange or boring. For a boy who often felt isolated by his love of learning, Harper's friendship represented something precious. "All right," Caleb said finally. "But you should know that we don't have cable television. The internet connection is unreliable, and dinner usually involves whatever I can make from scratch." "That sounds perfect," Victoria said, and Caleb was surprised to realize she meant it. "Harper and I both need more reality in our lives." As they drove back up the mountain, Owen was unusually quiet, his attention focused on the landscape passing outside his window. Finally, he spoke. "Dad, do you think Miss Hale is lonely?" The question caught Caleb off guard with its insight. "What makes you ask that?" "She asks a lot of questions about what it's like to live here, about our routines and how we spend time together. And when Harper talks about staying with us during the blizzard, Miss Hale gets this look on her face like she's remembering something she lost." Caleb considered his son's observation as they navigated the familiar curves of the mountain road. Victoria Hale had built an empire and accumulated wealth beyond most people's imagination, but Owen had identified something that money couldn't buy: the simple contentment that came from belonging somewhere and being connected to people who knew and cared about you. "I think you might be right," Caleb said finally. "Sometimes success in one area of life comes at the cost of other things that are just as important." "Like family time?" Owen asked. "Like family time," Caleb agreed. "And like having a place where you can just be yourself without worrying about what other people expect from you." As they pulled into their driveway, Caleb found himself looking at his modest cabin with new eyes. It wasn't much by conventional standards: no luxury amenities, no impressive architecture, no statement about wealth or status. But it was home in the deepest sense of the word, a place where love and acceptance mattered more than achievement or acquisition. The weekend visit would be a test of whether the growing connection between their families could survive the intimacy of shared domestic space. For the first time since Sarah's death, Caleb found himself both nervous and excited about opening his home to someone new. The weekend arrived with the kind of crisp March weather that made the mountains look like a postcard: clear skies, brilliant sunshine, and snow that sparkled like scattered jewels on the peaks. Caleb had spent the better part of Friday evening preparing the cabin for his guests, a process that involved more soul-searching than actual cleaning. How do you make a modest home feel welcoming to people accustomed to luxury without trying to be something you're not? Victoria and Harper arrived Saturday morning in a rental SUV that looked more practical than her usual corporate vehicles. Harper burst through the cabin door with the enthusiasm of someone returning to a beloved retreat, immediately seeking out Owen to share news of her latest adventures in the city. Victoria followed more slowly, carrying a simple overnight bag and wearing jeans that actually looked like they'd been worn before. "Thank you for having us," Victoria said, accepting the cup of coffee Caleb offered. "Harper has been counting the days since you agreed to this visit." Through the kitchen window, they could see Owen and Harper already deep in conversation near the woodpile, Harper examining something Owen was showing her with the intensity of a serious scientist. The easy camaraderie between the children was remarkable, considering how different their backgrounds were. "She's good for him," Caleb observed. "Owen doesn't often meet kids who are interested in the same things he is." "The feeling is mutual," Victoria said. "Harper's tutors are excellent, but they can't provide what Owen offers: genuine enthusiasm for learning without any agenda beyond curiosity." As the morning progressed, Caleb found himself seeing his home through Victoria's eyes. She noticed details that he'd long taken for granted: the way the morning light fell across the handmade kitchen table, the collection of Owen's nature sketches pinned to the refrigerator, the comfortable disorder of a space where people actually lived rather than simply displayed their possessions. "You built most of this yourself?" Victoria asked, running her hand along the smooth surface of a bookshelf that Caleb had crafted from local pine. "Over the years," Caleb confirmed. "Started as a way to save money, but it became something more. There's satisfaction in creating something useful with your own hands." Victoria picked up a framed photograph from the shelf Caleb Owen, and Sarah at Owen's 6th birthday party, all of them laughing at something outside the camera's range. The image captured a moment of pure joy, the kind of candid happiness that professional photographers struggled to recreate. "Sarah was beautiful," Victoria said softly, studying the photograph. "Owen has her eyes." "She was," Caleb agreed, accepting the photo back and replacing it carefully on the shelf. "She died in a car accident 5 years ago. Black ice on the mountain road, none of those things that happens too fast to prevent." "I'm sorry," Victoria said, and Caleb could hear genuine sympathy in her voice. "It must have been devastating." "It was," Caleb said simply. "For a while I wasn't sure how Owen and I were going to manage, but we figured it out, day by day. You adapt because you have to, and because the alternative is giving up on the people who still need you." Victoria was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving to the children outside, who were now building what looked like a complex structure from fallen branches. "I admire that. When my marriage ended, I threw myself into work. It was easier than dealing with the emotional mess of divorce and trying to explain to Harper why her father had decided we weren't worth his time anymore." The admission surprised Caleb with its honesty. "That must have been difficult for both of you." "Harper handled it better than I did, honestly," Victoria said with a rueful smile. "Children are remarkably resilient when adults don't burden them with their own anxiety. I, on the other hand, decided that professional success could substitute for personal happiness. It took finding Harper lost in a blizzard to realize how wrong I was." They were interrupted by the children bursting through the door, Owen carrying his field notebook and Harper clutching what appeared to be several interesting rocks. "Dad, we found something amazing," Owen announced, his face flushed with excitement. "Show him, Harper." Harper carefully unwrapped one of the rocks, revealing what looked like a fossil embedded in the stone. "Owen says it might be from when this whole area was underwater millions of years ago. Is that really possible?" Caleb examined the fossil with appropriate seriousness, though he was more interested in watching Victoria's reaction to her daughter's enthusiasm. The corporate executive had been replaced by a mother who was genuinely delighted by her child's discovery. "Absolutely possible," Caleb confirmed. "The whole Rocky Mountain region was covered by ancient seas at various times. You might have found evidence of creatures that lived here long before any of us." "Could we research it?" Harper asked, looking between Owen and her mother. "Owen has books about geology, and maybe we could find out exactly what kind of creature this was." "That sounds like an excellent project," Victoria said. "We could probably arrange for a paleontologist from the university to examine it properly." The rest of the morning was spent in the kind of comfortable domestic routine that Caleb hadn't shared with anyone outside his immediate family since Sarah's death. Victoria helped prepare lunch while the children worked on their fossil research, and gradually, the initial awkwardness of having houseguests evolved into something that felt surprisingly natural. "You know," Victoria said as they assembled sandwiches together, "I haven't cooked a meal from scratch in months. Everything in my life has become so streamlined and efficient that I'd forgotten how satisfying simple tasks can be." "Sarah used to say that the best conversations happened in kitchens," Caleb replied, handing her a jar to open. "Something about working with your hands while you talk that makes it easier to be honest." "She sounds like she was wise," Victoria said. She was. She was also stubborn, opinionated, and completely convinced that she could improve everyone around her through sheer force of will. Caleb smiled at the memory. "Owen gets his determination from her." Victoria glanced toward the living room where Owen was patiently explaining geological time periods to Harper using a timeline he'd drawn on notebook paper. "He's remarkable. The way he thinks about problems, his attention to detail, he has the mind of a real scientist." "He does," Caleb agreed, "but he also has something that's harder to teach: genuine curiosity about the world and kindness toward the creatures that share it with us. Sarah always said those qualities were more important than intelligence alone." As they sat down to lunch, Caleb found himself studying the scene with a mixture of contentment and bewilderment. 2 weeks ago, Victoria Hale had been a name in business magazines and a distant figure representing a world he barely understood. Now she was sitting at his kitchen table, listening with genuine interest, as Owen explained his theories about local geological formations, while Harper contributed observations that showed she'd inherited her mother's sharp mind. "Mom," Harper said during a pause in Owen's lecture, "could we stay another night? Owen promised to show me the owl nesting area tomorrow morning." Victoria looked at Caleb questioningly. "If it's not an imposition—" "It's not," Caleb said, though he felt a flutter of nervousness about extending their time together. The weekend visit was going well, but another day would deepen the intimacy of their shared space in ways that might complicate their professional relationship. "Actually," Victoria said, "I have a confession to make. I was hoping you'd invite us to stay longer. Harper's been happier this weekend than I've seen her in months, and She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I've forgotten what it feels like to be part of a family routine that isn't scheduled and managed by assistants." The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than anything Victoria had shared about her business empire or financial success. Caleb realized that for all her achievements, Victoria Hale was fundamentally lonely, isolated by wealth and responsibility from the simple human connections that gave life meaning. "Then you should stay," he said simply. "Owen loves having someone to share his interests with, and Harper asks the kind of questions that make him think harder about what he knows." As the afternoon wore on, the four of them settled into the kind of easy companionship that usually took months to develop. Victoria read while Caleb worked on a piece of furniture in his workshop, the children's voices providing a soundtrack of discovery and shared excitement as they explored the woods around the cabin. When evening came, they gathered around the fireplace as they had during Harper's first visit, but this time the storytelling was shared. Owen read from his nature journal, describing the behavioral patterns he'd observed in various animals. Harper contributed her own observations from city life, the habits of pigeons in downtown Denver, the way office building lights affected bird migration patterns, the small urban ecosystems that most people overlooked. Victoria found herself contributing stories from her travels, not the usual business anecdotes about negotiations and acquisitions, but personal observations about different places and cultures that revealed a curiosity about the world that went beyond profit margins. "You know," Caleb said as the fire began to die down, "I think Sarah would have liked both of you. She always said the best people were the ones who noticed things that others missed and cared about things that others overlooked." It was the highest compliment he could offer, and from Victoria's expression, she understood its significance. As they prepared for bed, Caleb reflected on how much had changed in just 2 days. The cabin felt more alive, with 4 people in it, filled with the kind of warm chaos that came from different personalities, finding ways to complement each other. But as he lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the mountain night, Caleb also felt a growing awareness that this weekend represented a crossroads. The comfortable companionship they'd discovered couldn't be easily categorized or controlled. It was either the beginning of something significant or a brief interlude that would make their return to separate worlds more difficult. The family photograph on his nightstand seemed to watch him in the darkness, Sarah's smile reminding him that love always required courage, the willingness to risk disappointment for the possibility of joy. Tomorrow would bring decisions about what came next, but tonight, for the first time in years, his home felt complete. Sunday morning brought a gentle snowfall that transformed the mountain landscape into a winter wonderland, each flake catching the early light like tiny crystals. Victoria woke to the sound of Caleb moving quietly in the kitchen, the familiar rhythm of someone who had perfected the art of preparing breakfast without waking the household. She lay still for a moment, listening to the peaceful sounds of domestic life, something she'd forgotten existed in her world of hotel rooms and corporate apartments. Harper and Owen were still asleep in Owen's room, where they'd stayed up late the night before sharing stories and planning their morning expedition to the owl nesting sites. Victoria had been surprised by how easily Harper had adapted to sharing space with someone else, considering she'd spent most of her life in private rooms with every comfort money could provide. "Good morning," Caleb said softly as Victoria appeared in the kitchen, drawn by the smell of coffee and something that smelled remarkably like fresh bread. "I hope the couch was comfortable enough." "More comfortable than most hotel beds," Victoria replied honestly, accepting the mug of coffee he offered. "Is that bread I smell?" "Owen's favorite Sunday morning treat," Caleb explained, checking a loaf in the oven. "Sarah's recipe. It's become something of a tradition for us." Victoria found herself moved by the simple continuity of the ritual way of keeping Sarah's memory alive through the sensory experience of taste and smell. It was the kind of intimate family tradition that her own household had never developed, too focused on efficiency and achievement to create space for such gentle repetitions. "You've built something beautiful here," she said, gesturing to encompass not just the physical space, but the entire atmosphere of warmth and belonging that permeated the cabin. "We've been fortunate," Caleb replied, though Victoria could hear the careful choice of words that acknowledged their financial struggles without dwelling on them. "Sometimes the best things in life are the ones you can't buy." The observation might have sounded trite coming from someone else, but from Caleb it carried the weight of lived experience. Victoria realized that she was learning to see wealth differently, not just as financial resources, but as the abundance that came from deep connections and meaningful routines. The children emerged from their room with the excitement of explorers preparing for a grand adventure. Owen had prepared a detailed plan for their morning hike, complete with maps showing the owl nesting locations and a list of other wildlife they might encounter. Harper listened with the focused attention of someone genuinely fascinated by the natural world, asking questions that showed she was beginning to understand the complex relationships between different species and their habitat. "Dad," Owen said over breakfast, "I was thinking about the data center project. What if we created a wildlife observation area as part of the facility? Somewhere that school groups could visit to learn about the local ecosystem." "That's an interesting idea," Caleb said, though he glanced at Victoria uncertainly. "What do you think, Victoria? Would something like that fit with your company's mission?" Victoria considered the suggestion carefully. "Actually, it might be perfect. We've been looking for ways to demonstrate our commitment to environmental stewardship beyond just the technical specifications. An educational component could help the local community see the data center as a positive addition rather than an industrial intrusion. Harper could help design it," Owen continued enthusiastically. "She knows what kinds of things would interest kids our age, and she's good at explaining complicated things in ways that make sense." Harper beamed at the recognition of her abilities, and Victoria felt a familiar surge of pride in her daughter's intelligence. But more than that, she was struck by Owen's generous inclusion of Harper in his planinga quality that spoke to the values Caleb had instilled in his son. After breakfast, the four of them set out for the owl nesting sites, bundled in warm clothes and carrying Owen's field equipment. The fresh snow made the familiar trails look different, but Owen navigated with the confidence of someone who knew every tree and landmark. Victoria found herself thinking about the contrast between Owen's intimate knowledge of this small area and her own broad but superficial familiarity with dozens of cities around the world. "There," Owen whispered, pointing to a large pine tree about 50 yards ahead. "Great horned owl nest. The parents are probably hunting, but we might see movement if the owlets are active." They approached quietly, Owen and Harper leading the way with the careful movements of experienced wildlife observers. Victoria marveled at how her daughter had absorbed the protocols of respectful observation, tempering her usual enthusiasm with the patience required for serious nature study. "I see one," Harper whispered excitedly, pointing to a fluffy shape barely visible among the pine needles. "It's beautiful." Through Owen's binoculars, they took turns observing the young owl, which seemed to be practicing the head movements that would eventually allow it to scan for prey with the precision of its parents. The moment felt magical, a connection to wildness that existed independent of human concerns about profit or achievement. "This is what I want to protect," Victoria said quietly to Caleb as they watched the children document their observations. Not just the technical specifications or the environmental compliance, but the wonder that comes from sharing space with creatures that have their own purposes and intelligence. Caleb studied her with surprise. That's not what I expected to hear from a tech CEO. It's not what I expected to say, Victoria admitted. But spending time here, seeing the world through Owen's eyes and Harper's questions, it's changed how I think about what we're actually building. As they walked back toward the cabin, the children ranging ahead to investigate interesting tracks in the snow, Victoria found herself reflecting on how much her priorities had shifted over the past few weeks. The constant pressure of corporate responsibilities hadn't disappeared, but it had been joined by something else, growing awareness of values that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. Caleb, she said carefully, I have something to tell you. My board of directors has been asking questions about the amount of time I'm spending on this project. They're concerned that I'm becoming too emotionally invested in what should be a straightforward construction project. Caleb slowed his pace, sensing the significance of what Victoria was sharing. What did you tell them? That they're absolutely right, Victoria said with a slight smile. I am emotionally invested. For the first time in years, I'm working on something that feels meaningful beyond its financial returns. The question is whether that's a problem or an opportunity. They paused at a clearing where the children had stopped to examine what appeared to be deer tracks crisscrossing the snow. The scene was peaceful, almost idyllic, but Victoria's words carried an undertone of conflict that suggested their developing relationship existed in a larger context of competing pressures and expectations. What happens if your board decides it's a problem? Caleb asked. Then I'll have to make some difficult choices, Victoria said honestly. But I'm hoping it doesn't come to that. The project is exceeding all our technical and financial projections. The environmental modifications have actually improved our efficiency metrics, and the community engagement has generated positive publicity that's worth more than we spent on the design changes. But, Caleb prompted, sensing there was more. Victoria was quiet for a moment, watching Owen patiently explain tracking techniques to Harper. But they're not wrong about my emotional investment. I care about this project in ways that go beyond business considerations. I care about you and Owen, about what we're building together, about the example we're setting for our children. The admission hung between them, more intimate than anything they'd shared during their professional consultations. Caleb realized that Victoria was risking more than money or reputation on their relationship. She was gambling with a career that had defined her identity for decades. Victoria, he said gently, you don't have to choose between your professional success and, he paused, unsure how to define what was developing between them. And this, Victoria finished, I know I don't have to choose, but I want to. For the first time in my adult life, I want to build something that matters more than market share or technological innovation. I want to build a life that has room for the people I care about. That evening, as they prepared dinner together in the cabin's small kitchen, Victoria and Caleb fell into the kind of comfortable collaboration that usually took couples years to develop. She chopped vegetables while he prepared the main course, their movements synchronized in the way that comes from paying attention to each other's rhythms and preferences. The children had claimed the living room for an elaborate chess game that Owen was teaching Harper, using a hand-carved wooden set that Caleb had made during the long winter evenings after Sarah's death. The chess set had become a symbol of patience and strategy, but watching the children play, Victoria saw something else, the way complex challenges could become opportunities for connection when approached with the right spirit. Caleb, she said as they worked side by side, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. All right, he said, though his tone suggested he was bracing for a difficult question. Am I fooling myself about what's happening here, between us, I mean? Is this real, or am I just so desperate for authentic connection that I'm imagining something that isn't there? Caleb stopped chopping and turned to face her fully. Victoria, I've been asking myself the same question, but I think the answer is that it doesn't matter whether we can define what this is. What matters is that it feels real to both of us, and it's making both our children happier than they've been in years. Even though we come from completely different worlds, Victoria asked. Especially because we come from different worlds, Caleb replied. You bring resources and opportunities that I could never provide for Owen. I bring, he paused, searching for the right words. You bring wisdom, Victoria said quietly, and perspective, and the kind of groundedness that I've been missing for so long I'd forgotten it existed. You bring the possibility of a life that's about more than achievement and accumulation. As they sat down to dinner, the hand-carved chess set between them seemed to represent the patient, strategic thinking that their relationship would require. Neither of them was naive about the challenges they would face, the pressures from Victoria's corporate world, the media attention that followed her everywhere, the practical difficulties of merging two very different lifestyles. But as they watched Owen and Harper collaborate on clearing the dinner dishes, chattering about their plans for a nature documentary they wanted to create, both adults felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful together. The chess game could wait. Tonight, they were content to simply enjoy the warmth of shared domesticity and the promise of possibilities that neither of them had dared to imagine just a few weeks before. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in early April, when Caleb arrived at the data center construction site to find Victoria standing beside her rental car with her phone pressed to her ear, her expression tense in a way he hadn't seen since their first meeting. The easy confidence she'd developed over the past month had been replaced by the guarded posture of someone preparing for battle. "I understand your concerns," she was saying into the phone, her voice carrying the crisp authority of a corporate executive. "But the project is proceeding exactly as planned, and the environmental modifications have actually improved our efficiency metrics. No, I don't think my judgment has been compromised." A pause. "Marcus, I really don't think that's any of your business." Caleb felt a chill at the mention of the name. Marcus Hale, Victoria's ex-husband, and according to the business magazines Owen had researched at the library, a prominent attorney who specialized in high-stakes custody cases. The conversation continued for several more minutes, Victoria's responses becoming increasingly clipped and defensive. "Everything all right?" Caleb asked when she finally ended the call. Victoria's smile was strained. "Nothing I can't handle. Marcus is well. He's concerned about some recent media coverage of the project. Apparently, there have been some articles speculating about my extended stay in Frost River." "What kind of speculation?" Caleb asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. Before Victoria could answer, Owen came running from the construction trailer where he'd been reviewing engineering drawings with Sarah Chen. His usual enthusiasm was replaced by obvious distress. "Dad," he said breathlessly, "there are people with cameras at the bottom of the access road. They were asking questions about you and Ms. Hale." Victoria closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, Caleb saw something that looked like resignation mixed with determination. "I was hoping we'd have more time before this happened." "Before what happened?" Caleb asked, though the pieces were already falling into place in his mind. "Before my personal life became a public spectacle," Victoria said quietly. "Marcus has always been very good at using media attention to his advantage. If he's concerned about my parenting choices, he won't hesitate to make it a public issue." The implications hit Caleb like a physical blow. Their developing relationship, which had felt so natural and right in the privacy of his cabin, was about to be scrutinized by strangers who would reduce it to headlines and speculation. More importantly, Harper would be caught in the middle of whatever media storm Marcus was orchestrating. "Miss Hale?" Sarah Chen approached them with obvious reluctance, carrying what looked like a manila envelope. "This was just delivered by courier. The messenger said it required your immediate attention." Victoria accepted the envelope, her hands steady despite the tension in her face. As she read the contents, her expression grew increasingly grim. "What is it?" Caleb asked. "Custody modification papers," Victoria said flatly. "Marcus is petitioning for primary custody of Harper, citing my recent erratic behavior and questionable judgment in associating with unsuitable individuals." She looked up from the documents, her eyes blazing with anger. "He's using our relationship as evidence that I'm an unfit mother." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming what had been a place of collaboration and growing intimacy into a battlefield where their personal happiness was being weaponized against Victoria's relationship with her daughter. "There's more," Victoria continued, scanning the legal documents. "He's requesting immediate temporary custody, pending a full hearing, claiming that Harper is at risk due to my emotional instability and poor decision-making." Owen looked between the adults, his young face reflecting the growing understanding that the safe world they'd built together was under attack. "What does that mean for Harper?" "It means," Victoria said carefully, "that her father is trying to take her away from me because he disapproves of the choices I've made." Caleb felt a surge of protective anger, not just for Victoria but for Harper, who would be devastated to lose the sense of family she'd found in their small mountain community. "Can he do that? Just because we're..." "Because we're what, Caleb?" Victoria asked, and he could hear the pain beneath her controlled tone. "Because I've found happiness with someone he considers beneath my social status? Because I've discovered that there are things more important than corporate success and financial accumulation." The sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their conversation. Through the trees, Caleb could see a convoy of black SUVs making their way up the access road, followed by what looked like news vans and cars carrying photographers with long-lens cameras. "He's here," Victoria said, her voice hollow. "Marcus doesn't waste time when he senses an advantage." The first SUV pulled up to the construction site, and Marcus Hale emerged with the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Caleb's truck, and moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning battles through sheer force of will and superior resources. Behind him came a small army of legal and media professionals, transforming the peaceful construction site into something resembling a hostile corporate takeover. Caleb realized that he was about to be evaluated by people whose entire worldview was based on metrics he neither understood nor respected. "Victoria," Marcus said, his tone carrying just enough warmth to suggest concern, while maintaining the cool authority of someone delivering an ultimatum. "I think we need to talk." "Hello, Marcus," Victoria replied, her corporate mask sliding back into place. "I assume this dramatic entrance is for the benefit of your media friends." "This is about Harper's welfare," Marcus said smoothly. "I'm concerned about the environment you're exposing her to, and the example you're setting with your..." His gaze moved to Caleb with obvious disdain. "Recent lifestyle choices." Caleb felt the weight of Marcus's assessment like a physical blow. In his work clothes and practical boots, standing beside his 15-year-old pickup truck, he knew exactly how he appeared to someone like Marcus Hale, blue-collar opportunist, trying to take advantage of a wealthy woman's temporary emotional vulnerability. "Mr. Tanner, isn't it?" Marcus continued, extending his hand in a gesture that managed to be both polite and insulting. "I understand you've been providing consultation services for my ex-wife's project. I'm sure the compensation has been quite generous." The implication was clear that Caleb's relationship with Victoria was fundamentally transactional, based on financial opportunity rather than genuine connection. It was exactly the kind of narrative that would play well in tabloid coverage and custody hearings. "Marcus," Victoria said sharply, "Caleb's professional qualifications speak for themselves. His environmental expertise has improved every aspect of this project." "I'm sure it has," Marcus replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But we're not here to discuss environmental consulting. We're here to discuss Harper's welfare and your fitness as a parent." Owen stepped closer to his father, and Caleb put a protective hand on his son's shoulder. The boy had become a target simply by association, his quiet intelligence and serious demeanor no match for the machinery of legal and media manipulation that Marcus had brought to bear. "Where is Harper now?" Marcus asked Victoria, his tone sharpening. "I assume she's not with you during these working meetings?" "She's in school," Victoria replied carefully. "Her regular private school in Denver." "Good," Marcus said. Because I've obtained a temporary restraining order preventing you from removing her from the state pending our custody hearing. I'm also requesting supervised visitation only, given your recent emotional instability." The legal papers he handed to Victoria seemed to drain the color from her face. Caleb realized that Marcus had orchestrated this confrontation with surgical precision, using Victoria's happiness against her and transforming their developing relationship into evidence of parental unfitness. "You bastard," Victoria said quietly, her composure finally cracking. "You've barely seen Harper 6 times in the past year, and now you want to play the concerned father." "I want to protect my daughter from the consequences of her mother's midlife crisis," Marcus replied smoothly. "Courts tend to look unfavorably on parents who prioritize their romantic interests over their children's stability." The photographers were capturing every moment of the confrontation, their long lenses turning private pain into public entertainment. Caleb realized that regardless of the legal outcome, their relationship had already been transformed into something tawdry and scandalous in the eyes of people who would never understand what they'd actually built together. "Victoria," he said quietly, "maybe I should go." "No," she said firmly, though he could see the conflict in her eyes. "Don't let him drive you away." But even as she spoke, Caleb could see the impossible position Marcus had created. Every moment Victoria spent defending their relationship was being used as evidence against her fitness as a mother. Every gesture of affection or support between them would be twisted into proof that she cared more about her personal happiness than her daughter's welfare. The cruelest part was that Harper herself would be caught in the middle, forced to choose between the mother she loved and the father who was positioning himself as her protector. The simple joy she'd found in their makeshift family would become a weapon in her parents' custody battle. As the media circus continued to grow around them, with reporters shouting questions and cameras capturing every angle of their distress, Caleb realized that Marcus Hale had achieved something remarkable. He'd turned their greatest strength into their greatest vulnerability. The love and connection that had brought their families together was now being used to tear them apart. The manila envelope in Victoria's hands contained more than legal documents. It contained the power to destroy everything they'd built together, transforming their careful courtship into a cautionary tale about the dangers of crossing social boundaries. And somewhere in Denver, Harper was about to discover that the family she'd found in a mountain cabin during a blizzard was now being used as evidence that her mother didn't deserve to keep her. The media storm that followed Marcus's legal ambush transformed Frost River from a quiet mountain town into the center of a national spectacle. Within 24 hours, news vans lined the main street. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk about Victoria Hale's mountain romance, and photographers with telescopic lenses had taken up positions on the ridges surrounding Caleb's cabin. Victoria had returned to Denver to fight the custody challenge, leaving behind a silence that felt more devastating than any argument. Her last words to Caleb had been delivered in the parking lot of the construction site, surrounded by cameras and shouted questions. "I have to protect Harper. You understand that, don't you?" He did understand, which made the separation no less painful. For 3 days, Caleb and Owen had been virtual prisoners in their own home, unable to leave without being followed by reporters, eager for any detail about the ski lift operator who captured a billionaire's heart. The romantic narrative the media had constructed bore no resemblance to the quiet, careful relationship that had actually developed between them. "Dad," Owen said on Thursday morning, looking up from his science journal where he'd been documenting the disruption to local wildlife caused by the media presence, "do you think Miss Hale will come back?" It was the question Caleb had been dreading, partly because he wasn't sure of the answer, and partly because he could see how much Owen had invested in their expanded family. "I don't know, son. She's fighting for Harper right now, and that has to be her priority." Owen nodded with the solemnity of someone far older than his 12 years. "Harper must be scared. All those reporters asking questions about her mum, and her dad trying to take her away from the only stability she's found." Caleb felt a surge of pride in his son's empathy. even as his heart ached for the little girl who had become so important to both of them. Harper was caught in the middle of adult conflicts she couldn't understand, her innocent joy in their mountain refuge now being used as evidence in a custody battle. The phone rang, constantly reporters wanting quotes, lawyers representing various parties, and concerned friends from town who were bewildered by the sudden attention. Caleb had stopped answering after the fifth call from tabloid journalists offering money for exclusive details about his relationship with Victoria. Sarah Chen arrived unexpectedly on Thursday afternoon, navigating through the media gauntlet with the determination of someone on a mission. She knocked on the cabin door with an urgency that immediately put Caleb on alert. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" Caleb asked, letting her into the cabin quickly before the photographers could capture another intimate moment to misinterpret. "Victoria asked me to bring you this," Sarah said, handing him a thick envelope marked "Confidential." "She couldn't come herself. The lawyers have advised her to avoid any contact with you until after the custody hearing." The envelope felt heavy in Caleb's hands, weighted with implications he wasn't sure he wanted to understand. "How is she?" "Fighting," Sarah said simply. "But Marcus has resources and connections that make this an uphill battle. He's arguing that Victoria's judgment has been compromised by an inappropriate relationship with someone who could be taking advantage of her emotional vulnerability." "And Harper?" Sarah's expression grew grim. Confused and angry, she doesn't understand why she can't see her mother freely or why her father suddenly wants to spend time with her after years of benign neglect. The court-appointed child advocate is trying to determine what's in her best interests, but it's a complicated situation. Caleb opened the envelope with trembling hands, finding inside a detailed legal analysis of the custody case, along with a personal letter in Victoria's careful handwriting. The legal documents painted a stark picture. Marcus's case was built on the narrative that Victoria had abandoned her corporate responsibilities and parental duties for a romantic relationship with someone of questionable motives. But it was Victoria's letter that hit him like a physical blow. "Caleb, I need you to know that everything we built together was real and meaningful, regardless of how the media chooses to portray it. You and Owen gave Harper and me something we'd never experienced, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with achievement or acquisition. But I also need you to understand that I may have to make choices that will hurt us both. Marcus is using our relationship as evidence that I'm an unfit mother, and every day that passes gives him more ammunition. The lawyers are advising me to demonstrate that my priorities are focused entirely on Harper's welfare, which means I can't ask you to wait for me. I don't know how long this legal battle will last or what compromises I'll have to make to keep my daughter. You and Owen deserve better than to be collateral damage in my family's dysfunction. Please know that loving you both was the best decision I've made in years, even if I have to live with the consequences of that choice. Victoria." The letter continued with practical matters instructions for the data center project, financial arrangements for Caleb's consulting work, and provisions for Owen's education that Victoria had apparently established before the legal crisis began. Even in her distress, she was trying to protect them from the fallout of their relationship. "She's prepared to sacrifice her own happiness to keep Harper," Caleb said quietly, handing the letter to Owen, who read it with the careful attention he brought to everything important. "That's what parents do," Owen replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But it's not fair. None of this is fair." Sarah was watching them both with obvious sympathy. "There might be another way," she said carefully, "but it would require taking some significant risks." "What kind of risks?" Caleb asked. "The custody hearing is scheduled for next Tuesday. Marcus's entire case is built on the narrative that Victoria is emotionally unstable and has poor judgment about relationships. But what if we could demonstrate the opposite? What if we could show that her relationship with you has actually made her a better parent and a more grounded person?" Caleb frowned. "How could we do that?" "Harper," Sarah said simply. "Her voice matters in this process. If she could testify about how happy she's been since meeting you and Owen, it might counter Marcus's narrative." but it would mean putting an 8-year-old child in the position of choosing between her parents in a public forum. The idea was both compelling and horrifying. Harper's testimony could indeed change the trajectory of the custody case, but asking a child to navigate such complex adult emotions in a courtroom setting seemed almost cruel. "There's more," Sarah continued. "The data center project has generated significant positive attention. Environmental groups, local business leaders, community organizations, they're all praising the collaborative approach and the innovative solutions that came from your partnership with Victoria. That's evidence of good judgment, not poor decision-making." Owen looked up from Victoria's letter with sudden animation. "What about the wildlife research? All the documentation we did, the solutions we developed that proves that Ms. Hale listens to good advice and makes decisions based on facts, not emotions." Caleb felt a flutter of hope at his son's words, but also a deep reluctance to involve the children further in what was essentially an adult conflict. Owen, Harper shouldn't have to testify in court about her parents' relationship. That's too much responsibility for a child. "But what if she wants to?" Owen asked. "What if she understands that this is her chance to help her mum keep custody? Harper's smart, Dad. She knows what's at stake." Sarah nodded. "The child advocate has been interviewing Harper about her preferences. From what I understand, she's been very clear about wanting to continue her relationship with both you and Victoria. Her testimony wouldn't be about choosing side-sit, would be about describing what makes her feel safe and happy." As they discussed the possibilities, Caleb found himself thinking about the emergency flare gun he kept in his truck for mountain emergencies. Sometimes, when you were lost in dangerous territory, you had to signal for help even if it revealed your location to potential threats. The custody hearing represented a similar momentous chance to send up a flare that might guide them all to safety, but only if they were willing to be vulnerable in public. "There's something else," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. "Social media has been buzzing about this story, but not all the attention is negative. There's been an outpouring of support for Victoria from people who see this as a father trying to punish his ex-wife for finding happiness. The hashtag #LetVictoriaLove has been trending. She showed them dozens of messages from people around the country who saw their story as a positive example of blended families and second chances. Environmental organizations praised the data center collaboration, while parenting advocates questioned Marcus's sudden interest in custody after years of minimal involvement in Harper's life. "Public opinion doesn't decide custody cases," Caleb pointed out, though he was moved by the support from strangers. "No, but it does influence the broader narrative," Sarah replied. "Marcus counted on portraying Victoria as unstable and you as opportunistic. But the actual evidence suggests something very different: a successful businesswoman who found balance through meaningful relationships, and a dedicated father who contributed valuable expertise to an important project." As the afternoon wore on, they developed a strategy that felt both necessary and terrifying. Victoria's legal team would present evidence of her improved work-life balance, the success of the data center collaboration, and the positive impact of her relationship with Caleb and Owen on Harper's well-being. But the plan's success would depend on Harper's willingness to speak honestly about her experiences and on the court's ability to see past Marcus's carefully constructed narrative. "There's one more thing," Sarah said as she prepared to leave. "Victoria wanted me to tell you that regardless of what happens in court, she doesn't regret anything that's happened between you. She said to tell you that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that teach us who we really are, win or lose." That evening, as Caleb and Owen sat by the fire discussing the custody hearing and their possible role in it, the cabin felt both smaller and larger than usual. Smaller because of the weight of the decisions they faced. Larger because of the love that had expanded to include people who weren't physically present but remained essential to their sense of family. "Dad," Owen said as they prepared for bed, "what if we lose? What if the judge decides that Harper should live with her father and Victoria can't see her?" Caleb pulled his son close, feeling the familiar weight of parental responsibility in the face of circumstances beyond his control. Then we'll have learned something important about love, Owen. That it's worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you, and that sometimes the people who matter most to us are worth taking risks for. Outside, the media encampment continued its vigil, waiting for any development in the story they'd reduced to headlines and speculation. But inside the cabin, two people who had found unexpected love and purpose in their collision with a different world prepared to fight for the family they'd discovered together, knowing that Tuesday's hearing would determine whether their story ended in separation or in a new kind of beginning. The Denver family court building buzzed with activity on Tuesday morning, its halls filled with reporters, legal teams, and curious spectators drawn by the high-profile custody case that had captured national attention. Caleb sat in the back row of the courtroom. Wearing his only sweater, 10-year-old navy blue outfit he'd purchased for Sarah's funeral and feeling completely out of place among the sea of expensive legal attire surrounding him. Victoria sat at the plaintiff's table with her legal team, her posture rigid with tension despite her composed expression. She'd acknowledged Caleb with a brief nod when he entered, but the lawyers had made it clear that any interaction between them could be used against her in the proceedings. The woman who had laughed with him over morning coffee just weeks ago now seemed like a stranger, armored in professional distance. Marcus occupied the defendant's table with his own army of attorneys, projecting the confident demeanor of someone who believed victory was inevitable. His case was built on a simple narrative. Victoria Hale had suffered a breakdown in judgment that made her unfit for primary custody of their daughter. The evidence would show romantic involvement with a man of questionable motives, neglect of corporate responsibilities, and erratic decision-making that put Harper's stability at risk. Judge Patricia Morales called the court to order with the efficient authority of someone who had presided over countless family disputes. She was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see through the legal posturing to the human drama beneath. Her reputation for fairness was legendary, but she was also known for her intolerance of manipulation and grandstanding. "This is a petition for modification of custody arrangements," Judge Morales began, "filed by Marcus Hale seeking primary custody of the minor child, Harper Elizabeth Hale, currently in the primary custody of her mother, Victoria Hale. Mr. Brennan, you may present your opening statement." Marcus's lead attorney was a silver-haired man named Robert Brennan, who moved with the predatory grace of someone who specialized in high-stakes family law. His opening statement painted Victoria as a successful businesswoman who had lost her way, abandoning her responsibilities for an inappropriate relationship with a man who stood to benefit financially from her emotional vulnerability. "Your Honor," Brennan said, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority, "the evidence will show that Ms. Hale has undergone a dramatic personality change in recent months. She has neglected her corporate duties, spending weeks in a remote mountain location with a man she barely knows. She has exposed young Harper to unstable living conditions and questionable influences, prioritizing her romantic interests over her daughter's need for consistency and appropriate supervision." Caleb felt each word like a physical blow, watching his relationship with Victoria being transformed into something sordid and calculated. The truth of their careful courtship, the genuine connection they'd found, the positive impact on both their children, none of that fit the narrative Brennan was constructing. Victoria's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Torres, presented a very different picture in her opening statement. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Ms. Hale has found balance in her life for the first time in years. Her relationship with Mr. Tanner began as a professional consultation that evolved into a meaningful partnership benefiting both families. Harper has thrived in this environment, developing interests in science and nature while maintaining her academic excellence. Mr. Hale's sudden interest in custody comes only after years of minimal involvement in his daughter's life. The first witness called was Marcus himself, who testified with the polished confidence of someone comfortable in legal settings. He described his concerns about Victoria's recent behavior, her extended absences from corporate headquarters, and her involvement with someone who lacked appropriate credentials and social standing. "I became alarmed," Marcus testified, "when Harper began talking about wanting to live in a cabin in the mountains. She was describing a lifestyle completely foreign to her upbringing, influenced by people who don't share our values or educational priorities." During cross-examination, Torres pressed Marcus about his own involvement in Harper's life, revealing that he had missed numerous scheduled visitations and had shown little interest in her daily activities or academic progress. But Marcus deflected each question with the skill of someone trained in legal maneuvering, always returning to his concerns about Victoria's judgment. The next witness was Dr. Patricia Wynne, a child psychologist who had evaluated Harper at Marcus's request. Her testimony was devastating in its clinical detachment as she described signs of confusion and anxiety in the child, attributing these to the instability created by Victoria's erratic behavior and inappropriate relationship choices. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Wynne concluded, "Harper would benefit from a more structured environment with clear boundaries and age-appropriate influences. The current situation exposes her to adult conflicts and lifestyle choices that are not in her best interests." Victoria's team countered with their own expert, Dr. Michael Chen, who had conducted his own evaluation of Harper. His testimony painted a very different picture of a child who had found joy and intellectual stimulation in her expanded family situation. Harper demonstrated exceptional emotional intelligence in discussing her experiences, Dr. Chen testified. She spoke with genuine enthusiasm about her scientific projects with Owen Tanner and her sense of belonging in what she called her mountain family. There were no signs of distress or confusion about her living situation, quite the opposite, in fact. But the most crucial moment came when Judge Morales called Harper herself to testify. The 8-year-old entered the courtroom wearing a simple blue dress, her dark hair neatly braided, looking far too young to be caught in the middle of such adult complexities. Victoria's composure finally cracked as she watched her daughter being sworn in, tears streaming down her face at the sight of Harper having to navigate this impossible situation. "Hello, Harper," Judge Morales said gently, her voice softening in a way that hadn't been evident during the adult testimony. "Do you understand why you're here today?" "Yes, ma'am," Harper replied, her voice small but clear. "Daddy wants me to live with him instead of Mommy, and I have to tell you what I want." "That's right. And I want you to know that whatever you say, you're not in trouble, and both your parents love you very much. Can you tell me about where you've been happiest recently?" Harper's answer was delivered with the straightforward honesty that only children possess. "I was happiest at Caleb's cabin with Owen. They taught me about animals and stars, and Caleb read me stories every night. Owen showed me how to keep a science journal, and Mommy was happy there too. She smiled more than she does at home." Judge Morales leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about Owen and Caleb. How did they make you feel?" "Safe," Harper said without hesitation. "Like I belonged there. Owen is really smart, and he didn't make fun of my questions. Caleb fixed my broken toy and taught me how to stack wood for the fire. They made Mommy laugh, and she wasn't always checking her phone." The courtroom was completely silent as Harper continued, her words carrying more weight than any expert testimony. "Daddy never reads me stories or teaches me things. He's always busy with work, just like Mommy used to be. But when we were at the cabin, nobody was too busy for me." During Marcus's attorney's cross-examination, Harper's responses remained consistent and heartfelt. Yes, she understood that the cabin was different from her usual home. No, she didn't feel unsafe or uncomfortable there. Yes, she wanted to continue seeing Owen and Caleb because they were part of her family now. "But Harper," Brennan pressed, "don't you think you'd be more comfortable in a house with your own room and all your toys?" Harper considered this seriously. "I have my own room at Mommy's house, and I have lots of toys. But at the cabin, I had something better. I had people who wanted to spend time with me." The simple statement hung in the courtroom air like an indictment of the adult world's priorities. Caleb felt his throat tighten as he watched this remarkable child articulate truths that the legal system seemed determined to complicate. When Harper was finally dismissed, she walked directly to Victoria, who knelt down to embrace her daughter with fierce protectiveness. The image of mother and child clinging to each other while lawyers and judges decided their fate was seared into Caleb's memory as a symbol of everything that was wrong with reducing family love to legal arguments. "The court will take a brief recess," Judge Morales announced, her voice carrying a weight that suggested she had heard enough to begin forming her decision. As the courtroom emptied for the break, Caleb found himself staring at the witness stand, where Harper had just delivered the most honest testimony of the day. An 8-year-old child had articulated the fundamental truth that all the legal maneuvering obscured. Families were built on love and attention, not on social status or financial resources. The worn fairy tale book that Harper had carried into the courtroom sat on the table beside Victoria's legal papers, a tangible reminder of the storytelling tradition that had first brought their families together. In a room filled with legal documents and expert opinions, it represented the simple human connections that were actually at stake in this complex battle for custody and love. When court reconvened after the recess, Judge Morales wore the expression of someone who had spent the break wrestling with complex questions that went far beyond legal precedent. Harper's testimony had shifted something fundamental in the courtroom atmosphere, transforming what had begun as a clinical evaluation of parental fitness into a more profound examination of what actually constituted a child's best interests. Victoria's attorney called Caleb as their final witness, a decision that carried enormous risk. His testimony could either validate Victoria's choices or confirm Marcus's narrative about inappropriate relationships and questionable judgment. As Caleb walked to the witness stand, he felt the weight of everyone's future resting on his ability to articulate truths that transcended social expectations and financial considerations. "Mr. Tanner," Rebecca Torres began, "please tell the court how you met Harper and Victoria Hale." Caleb's voice was steady as he recounted the blizzard night when he'd found Harper trudging through the snow, the simple act of kindness that had led to everything that followed. He described bringing the frightened child to his cabin, reading her stories by the fireplace, and the gradual realization that she came from a world completely different from his own. "When Victoria arrived to collect Harper," Caleb continued, "my first impression was of a mother who had been terrified for her child's safety. Everything else, her wealth, her corporate position, her social status, was secondary to her relief at finding Harper safe. Torres guided him through the development of their professional relationship, the data center consultations, and the gradual evolution into something more personal." Caleb spoke carefully but honestly about Victoria's genuine interest in environmental protection, her respect for local knowledge, and her dedication to building something that would benefit the entire community. "Mr. Tanner," Torres said, "Mr. Brennan has suggested that your relationship with Ms. Hale is motivated by financial gain. How do you respond to that characterization?" Caleb looked directly at Marcus as he answered, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had nothing to hide. "I responded to Victoria's first offer of payment by asking only for a museum trip for my son. When she offered me consulting work, I told her I would speak up if I saw anything harmful to the environment, even if it cost her money. Those aren't the actions of someone motivated by financial gain." "What was your impression of Harper during her visits to your home?" "Harper is a remarkable child," Caleb said, his voice warming as he spoke about the little girl who had become so important to him. "She's intelligent, curious, and kind. More importantly, she was genuinely happy. She asked thoughtful questions, participated enthusiastically in activities, and formed a real friendship with my son, Owen. I saw no signs of distress or confusion, quite the opposite." During cross-examination, Brennan attacked Caleb's qualifications, his modest income, and his suitability as an influence on a child of Harper's background. But each question only reinforced the fundamental integrity that had drawn Victoria to him in the first place. "Mr. Tanner, you work as a ski lift operator. Do you really think you're qualified to provide guidance to the daughter of one of America's most successful businesswomen?" "I'm qualified to care about her well-being. Caleb replied simply. I'm qualified to read her bedtime stories, to answer her questions about nature, and to treat her with the respect and attention that every child deserves. If those qualifications aren't enough, then I'm not sure what would be. The courtroom stirred at his response, and Caleb could see Judge Morales making notes with obvious interest. Marcus's strategy of emphasizing class differences was backfiring, highlighting his own privileged detachment rather than Caleb's inadequacy. Mr. Hale has suggested that your relationship with Ms. Hale represents poor judgment on her part. What's your response? Caleb paused, choosing his words carefully. Victoria Hale is one of the most intelligent, thoughtful people I've ever met. She's also been carrying enormous responsibilities alone for years. If finding balance in her life and creating space for personal relationships represents poor judgment, then I think we need to reconsider what we expect from successful women. When Caleb was dismissed, he felt the strange combination of relief and vulnerability that comes from public honesty. He had told the truth as completely as possible, but the decision now rested with Judge Morales, who would have to weigh his words against expert testimony, legal precedent, and the complex realities of modern family structures. The final witness was Victoria herself, called by her own legal team to address the charges against her directly. She took the stand with the composed dignity that had served her well in countless corporate negotiations, but Caleb could see the emotional strain beneath her professional demeanor. Ms. Hale, Rebecca Torres began, please tell the court about your relationship with your daughter Harper. Victoria's voice softened as she spoke about Harper, their morning routines, Harper's intellectual curiosity, the challenges of balancing corporate responsibilities with motherhood. She described the guilt she'd carried about her demanding work schedule and her determination to create more space for personal relationships. Harper is the most important thing in my life, Victoria said, her composure finally showing cracks. Everything I've built, everything I've achieved, means nothing compared to being her mother. My relationship with Caleb didn't diminish that, it enhanced it. For the first time in years, I was modeling for Harper what it looks like to have balance, to prioritize relationships alongside achievement. Torres guided Victoria through the data center project, emphasizing how her collaboration with Caleb had improved both the environmental and financial outcomes. The evidence painted a picture of enhanced judgment rather than compromised decision-making. Ms. Hale, how has your relationship with Mr. Tanner affected your parenting? It's made me a better mother, Victoria said without hesitation, watching Caleb with Owen, seeing how he prioritizes his son's emotional and intellectual development. Learning from his patience and wisdom, it's taught me things about parenting that I never learned in business school. During cross-examination, Brennan pressed Victoria about her extended absences from corporate headquarters, her sudden personality changes, and her exposure of Harper to unsuitable influences. But Victoria's responses remained consistent and thoughtful, demonstrating the emotional stability that Marcus's case claimed she lacked. Ms. Hale, don't you think Harper would be better served by consistency and structure rather than romantic adventures in mountain cabins? Victoria's answer carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. Harper needs love, attention, and intellectual stimulation. She needs to see that successful adults can also be caring human beings who prioritize relationships. If that's what you call romantic adventure, then yes, I believe it's exactly what she needs. When testimony concluded, Judge Morales announced that she would review all evidence and render her decision within 24 hours. The brief recess felt like an eternity, as both legal teams prepared for the final arguments that would determine Harper's future. As the courtroom emptied, Caleb found himself standing in the hallway with Owen, who had watched the entire proceeding with the serious attention of someone far older than his 12 years. Victoria and Harper were surrounded by their legal team, but across the space between them, Caleb could see the same mixture of hope and terror in Victoria's eyes that he felt in his own heart. The hospital bracelet that Harper still wore from a recent checkup caught the fluorescent light as she clung to her mother's hand, a small reminder of vulnerability and the need for protection that went beyond legal arguments or social expectations. In just 24 hours, they would know whether love and authenticity could triumph over manipulation and prejudice, whether a judge could see past social conventions to the human truths that actually mattered. The outcome would determine not just custody arrangements, but whether two families who had found unexpected joy together would be allowed to continue building something meaningful, or whether the collision of their different worlds would ultimately tear them apart. 6 months later, the autumn air in Frost River carried the crisp promise of winter, and the aspen trees painted the mountainsides in brilliant gold that seemed to celebrate the season of transformation. The Hale Tech data center stood completed at the valley's edge, its sleek design harmoniously integrated with the natural landscape in ways that had earned recognition from environmental organizations across the country. What had begun as a corporate construction project had evolved into a model of sustainable development that honored both technological innovation and ecological wisdom. Caleb stood at the edge of the construction site, now transformed into a thriving facility that hummed quietly with the energy of thousands of servers, cooled by the geothermal systems he and Owen had helped design. The wildlife observation area that Owen had envisioned had become a reality, a beautifully crafted education center, where school groups regularly came to learn about the delicate balance between human progress and environmental protection. "The elk are using the new corridors perfectly," Owen announced, approaching with his ever-present field notebook and a smile that had become even brighter over the past months. The motion sensors captured a herd of 12 passing through just after dawn. "The modifications we made to the access roads are working exactly as we predicted." At 14 now, Owen had grown several inches and gained the kind of confidence that came from seeing his ideas implemented on a scale that affected real change in the world. The scholarship Victoria had arranged for him allowed him to attend an advanced science program in Denver 3 days a week, while continuing his environmental research in the mountains the rest of the time. "And Harper's documentation is getting more sophisticated every week," Owen continued enthusiastically. "She's developing her own methodology for tracking seasonal behavior changes. I think she might actually become a better scientist than I am." The mention of Harper brought a familiar warmth to Caleb's chest. The little girl who had stumbled through a blizzard into their lives had become a fixture in their family, spending every other weekend at the cabin and most of her school holidays exploring the mountains with Owen. Her custody arrangement with Victoria had been preserved, despite Marcus's legal challenge, and she split her time between Denver's educational opportunities and the mountain adventures that fed her growing passion for natural science. Judge Morales had rendered her decision with characteristic directness, finding that Harper's best interests were served by maintaining primary custody with Victoria while ensuring regular, meaningful contact with both her father and her extended mountain family. The judge's written opinion had praised Victoria's ability to provide both stability and enrichment for her daughter, while noting that Harper's obvious happiness and intellectual growth were evidence of sound parental judgment rather than emotional instability. Marcus had appealed the decision, of course, but the appeal had been quietly withdrawn when it became clear that the media narrative had shifted definitively in Victoria's favor. The story of a successful businesswoman finding balance and happiness had resonated with audiences far beyond Colorado, while Marcus's legal maneuvering had begun to look increasingly petty and vindictive. Victoria emerged from the data center's main building, wearing the practical work clothes that had become her preferred attire for site visits. Her hair was shorter now, styled in a way that looked both professional and approachable, and she moved with the easy confidence of someone who had found harmony between her different roles and responsibilities. "The final environmental impact report just came in," she announced, holding up a thick document with obvious satisfaction. "We exceeded every benchmark for sustainable operation, and the wildlife corridors are actually increasing biodiversity in the area. Owen's research is being cited as a model for future projects." She crossed to Caleb and kissed him with the comfortable affection of a relationship that had weathered significant storms and emerged stronger. Their marriage, 3 months earlier, had been a small ceremony held in the meadow near the cabin, with Harper and Owen as witnesses and the entire population of Frost River in attendance. The simplicity of the event had perfectly reflected their values, celebrating love and commitment without the elaborate displays that had characterized their previous lives. Speaking of future projects, Victoria continued, I got a call from the Department of Energy this morning. They want to discuss using our model for a series of data centers across the western states. It would mean significant travel for both of us, but also the chance to implement environmental protections on a national scale. Caleb considered the opportunity with the careful thoughtfulness that Victoria had learned to value above quick decisions. Their partnership had taught them both the importance of balancing ambition with family stability, professional growth with personal happiness. What would that mean for the kids' routines, he asked, his first concern always centered on Owen and Harper's well-being. That's what I love about you, Victoria said, smiling at the predictability of his priorities. Most people would ask about the money or the career implications first. But you're right, we'd need to structure it so Owen's education isn't disrupted and Harper's time with us remains consistent. They were interrupted by the sound of laughter from the education center, where Harper and a group of visiting students were examining something that had obviously captured their collective imagination. Through the large windows, they could see Harper explaining some aspect of local ecology with animated gestures, while Owen assisted with the kind of patient mentorship that came naturally to him. She's remarkable, Victoria said, watching her daughter with the pride that never failed to transform her expression. Yesterday, she asked me if she could spend next summer doing a research project with Owen, instead of going to the usual camps. She wants to document how the data center's cooling system affects local water temperatures throughout the season. And what did you tell her? That she could do both, Victoria replied. Research with Owen during the week, and whatever summer activities interest her on weekends. She's learning that she doesn't have to choose between different kinds of enrichment. She can have intellectual challenges and social experiences and family time. The concept of having it all had taken on new meaning for Victoria since their marriage. Instead of the exhausting attempt to excel in every area simultaneously, she had learned to integrate her various roles in ways that allowed each to enhance the others. Her corporate responsibilities now included a significant focus on environmental consulting, drawing on the expertise she'd gained through her collaboration with Caleb. Her parenting had been enriched by the partnership model she'd observed in his relationship with Owen. Her personal happiness had been grounded in the kind of authentic connection she'd never thought possible. As the afternoon progressed, they walked through what had become their weekly ritual of reviewing the site's environmental metrics and planning improvements for the following week. The data center dedication plaque near the main entrance bore both their names, along with Owen's, recognizing the collaborative approach that had made the project's success possible. Caleb, Victoria said as they paused beside the plaque, do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped for Harper that night? It was a question they'd both pondered during the difficult months of the custody battle, when their future had seemed so uncertain. Sometimes, Caleb admitted. But I also think that meeting you and Harper wasn't really about chance. We were all ready for something different in our lives, we just didn't know what it looked like until we found each other. Owen says that you told him love requires courage, Victoria said. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. Not just romantic love, but the courage to build the kind of life that actually makes you happy, rather than the kind that looks impressive to other people. The observation captured something essential about their journey together. Both of them had learned to value authenticity over achievement, connection over accumulation, and the quiet satisfaction of meaningful work over the hollow validation of external success. As evening approached, they gathered the children for the drive back to the cabin, where Harper would spend the weekend exploring autumn ecology with Owen before returning to Denver for the school week. The routine had become natural over the months, a rhythm that honored both Harper's educational needs and her emotional attachment to the mountain family that had welcomed her during that long-ago blizzard. The cabin looked different now, expanded with addition that provided Harper with her own room and created space for Victoria's home office. But the essential character of the place remained unchanged. The stone fireplace where they still read stories on cold evenings, the handmade furniture that represented the value of patient craftsmanship, the sense of sanctuary that had drawn Victoria to Frost River in the first place. "Mum," Harper said as they prepared dinner together, using the title she'd started applying to Victoria with new confidence since the custody hearing, "Owen and I want to show you something after dinner. We've been working on a surprise." The surprise turned out to be a detailed proposal for expanding the data center's educational programs, complete with curriculum outlines, budget projections, and implementation timelines. Harper and Owen had spent weeks developing their ideas, combining Harper's intuitive understanding of what would interest other children with Owen's scientific rigor and research methodology. "We want to create a program where kids can do real research," Harper explained, her enthusiasm infectious. "Not just learn about ecology, but actually contribute to understanding how technology and nature can work together. And we want to invite schools from different economic backgrounds," Owen added. "Not just private schools, but public schools that might not normally have access to this kind of opportunity." Victoria and Caleb exchanged glances of amazement and pride as they reviewed the comprehensive proposal. Their children had absorbed not just environmental knowledge, but also values about equity, inclusion, and the responsibility that comes with privilege and opportunity. "This is extraordinary," Victoria said, meaning it completely. "You've identified funding sources, partnership opportunities, and implementation strategies that rival professional grant proposals." "That's because we learned from the best," Harper said simply, looking between her mother and Caleb with the straightforward affection that had characterized all her relationships since finding security in their expanded family. As the evening wound down with the familiar ritual of bedtime stories and quiet conversation by the fire, Caleb reflected on the unexpected trajectory that had brought them all together. The data center dedication plaque had recognized their professional collaboration, but the true measure of their success was visible in simpler things. Harper's easy laughter, Owen's growing confidence, Victoria's relaxed contentment, and his own sense of purpose that extended far beyond individual achievement. The fairy tale book that Harper had carried through the custody hearing sat on the coffee table, its worn pages still capable of transporting listeners to worlds where kindness was rewarded and love conquered seemingly impossible obstacles. But looking around at his family, biological and chosen, conventional and unconventional, Caleb realized that their own story had elements of fairy tale magic woven throughout. Sometimes the most unexpected kindness really did come from the most unlikely places. And sometimes, when two different worlds collided with enough force to shake the foundations of what everyone thought they knew about love and family and success, the result wasn't destruction, but transformation, the creation of something new and beautiful that honored the best of both worlds while transcending the limitations of either one alone. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, coating the mountains in the same pristine white that had hidden Harper on that long-ago December night. But inside the cabin, four people who had found their way to each other through courage, kindness, and the willingness to risk everything for love continued the ancient human tradition of sharing stories by firelight, creating new chapters in a tale that would be told for generations to come.